Well, hello class. This is the mini lecture on Chapter 1 out of the Miller textbook. And I'm just going to quickly go through the pages, and I've highlighted certain things that I want to mention. And I'll have one of these on most of all the chapters that we'll cover, so please be sure to look for the announcement that will give you the link to get to this video. Okay, Chapter 1, of course, is going to start out with an introduction to what is environmental studies, what is environmental science, what are environmental problems, how do we study them, how do we try to solve them. It starts off with sort of the three principles of sustainability. Sustainability is a little bit more current word than ecology, certainly, and even environmental. It's basically based on the premise that if you take better care of the earth and use the resources wisely, it will sustain us for a longer time. And by us, I don't mean just the human beings, but also all the animals and plants that share the planet with us. So sustainability, practices that will help sustain a good environment and a good quality of living for people now and also into the future. And you can see the three principles of sustainability have to do with things you pretty much know already. One is reliance on solar energy. So we know about that. All life on the planet is dependent on solar energy. It produces basically all the food that we eat, because if we count on photosynthesis for plants to use to make glucose out of sunlight and other chemicals. And then we either eat the plants directly or we eat the animals that eat the plants. So in one way or another, we're all dependent on that solar energy. And we also, of course, are now starting to use actual solar energy to produce electricity and hot water and things like that as well. So we're directly using it to produce energy for us, and not, let's say, indirectly using it to produce energy for us in the form of food. Biodiversity. It used to be said years and years ago that the way to see the healthiest ecosystem was to find one that had the most biodiversity. In other words, the most number of plants and animals that were interacting with one another. And if you had more, then it was a healthier, more stable ecosystem. Well, that may not be the absolute truth all the time, but it certainly is a good benchmark to go by. The more animals and plants you have in an ecosystem, the less chance that there'll be a major disruption if one of those animals or plants disappears. So if you have a basic farm field with monoculture, a cornfield, and you have, let's say, some rodents in there and maybe a hawk, you have, basically, three main players in that ecosystem, and, what happens if the mice disappears? Well, if the mice disappears, the hawk's going to go somewhere else, and, you're left with a much simpler, ecosystem. Though maybe the farmer would like that, and of course over time humans have tried to simplify ecosystems when we should be probably making them more complex. But if you take a complex ecosystem like the tropical rainforest in Brazil, and you have literally thousands and thousands and thousands of different plants and animals, per every acre, if one of them disappears or relocates, whatever, you're probably not going to see very much disruption. Because, with all those animals and plants, there's probably some other animal or plant that could take the place of that one that disappeared, fill its niche, which is a word we'll see when we get to Chapter 3 and study ecosystems in more detail. So this idea of biodiversity is important to us. It certainly is very important when it comes to food, where we used to have thousands of varieties of rice and corn and wheat. We now rely on one or two or three varieties, some of them genetically modified, and for whatever good or bad that brings with it. And but definitely losing the diversity of food crops and others is not a good idea. And last is the cycling of nutrients, or chemical cycling. This is the idea of recycling, basically, and that on the planet we are basically the Earth is a closed ecosystem. The only thing we get from the outside is energy from the sun, and once in a while we get a few extra minerals from a meteorite that might hit. And so we basically have to use the same chemicals over and over again for us to live. And so nature is very good at recycling. When things die, they have decomposers that decompose them and then put their chemicals back to use in the soil. And this idea of recycling and cycling chemicals is very important. And of course, we're catching on to that as we've started, major recycling programs in basically all around the country. And industry looks to this also to save money because you can use less raw resources when you're recycling. So those are those key components of sustainability. It also talks about resources, and you should know the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. Renewables are basically those that last forever, or for a very, very long time. Much longer than human existence will probably be around. Things like the sun, solar energy. As long as we have the sun, we'll probably have wind, so we'll have wind power. As long as the earth has hot areas underneath, like that cause volcanoes and so forth, we'll probably have geothermal energy. And so, these are renewable forms of energy. Again, they're not totally lasting forever, but for the most part, we can call them renewable, as opposed to, let's say, oil and natural gas, which were formed when plants and animals died millions of years ago, and they were trapped usually under the ocean or underwater for the most part, some on land, and they decomposed and their little dinosaur bodies and so forth turned into oil and into natural gas. There's only a certain amount on the Earth. There may not be as little as we thought years ago when we thought we were running out of energy. There still may be a good amount of, especially natural gas and even oil left. But there is some finite limit to that, so it's not a renewable source. We don't have animals and plants dying. It takes millions of years to make new oil and natural gas, and so it's just not happening at the rate that it happened, millions and millions of years ago, where lots of these organisms died, and we had changes in the geology, the geophysical makeup of the Earth to help form these pockets of gas and oil. So, renewable and non-renewable resources. Then we come to an important concept called pollution. You've all heard of pollution, air pollution. Living in California, of course, air pollution is a major concern. San Jose and, of course, Los Angeles Los Angeles having the worst air quality in the country. I worked for the South Coast Air Quality Management District, which is the regulatory agency that was helping to clean the air in Los Angeles, and we did quite a good job of helping to clean the air, though it's still the number one dirtiest city in the country. Not nearly so in the world, because there are many cities that are much more polluted. But we've made some gains on that. But what is pollution? Pollution isn't necessarily poison, but it's when a certain element gets to a certain level that it becomes unhealthy for humans or for the ecosystem. So it may be something that is good for us in small amounts. It may be something that doesn't harm us in small amounts, but when it gets to a certain level, we would consider it pollution because it starts to affect the health of an ecosystem or the actual health of a human or animal or plant. Pollution comes in we categorize it in two major ways: point sources and non-point sources. And if you want to think of a point source as here's a factory. Here's a pipe coming out of a factory. It's emptying pollution into a river. That is a point. You can very well define where the pollution's coming from. If you wanted to solve it, you could solve it very easily. You could shut off the pipe, or you could filter the pollution, or you could do a number of things. Point sources are much easier to deal with. Then we have non-point sources, which means they're coming from a diverse area. Think of an agricultural area where, let's say, fertilizers and pesticides are washing off, due to irrigation, washing off thousands of acres of farmland and going into the nearby, let's say, Mississippi River. It's not one point that is polluting that river. It's literally thousands or millions of points where that pollution is coming from. And so those kinds of non-point sources are a lot harder to attack because it's not just that one pipe you have to deal with. It's a whole system of farming and so forth. And those non-point sources have caused what we'll come to see as the what's called the dead spot. Not really dead, but the dead spot in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can look that up if you want to find out about that. Let's see. We also talk about ecological footprint. Some of you have already done the first homework on ecological footprint model and running the various runs of that model. So you'll find out a little bit about your own ecological footprint, and so go ahead and do that. I think you'll find it interesting. We're also want to find out, of course, why do we have environmental problems? And the book lays it out in about 4 basic causes. One is human population. Now, it used to be that back in the 60s, many people thought human population was the major cause of environmental problems. There was even a book written by the Stanford scientist Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb, saying the population is going to explode and it's going to cause all sorts of wars and disease and environmental disasters. And for the most part, it has not come true. And there are many reasons for that, and we'll study that when we get to the chapter on population. But definitely, the more people, the more resources that are used, and thus the more environmental issues that we have. So definitely population, is related to environmental issues. Next, we have affluence, or consumption. The more you consume, the more we need to use natural resources to support your lifestyle. So a person born here in the United States has a lot more consumption than, let's say, a baby born, let's say, in India or in or even a more developing country, and so even though there may be more people in less developed countries, the birth rate may be higher. We're probably, in fact, are using a lot more resources than countries with much larger populations because of our consumption. So consumption, our affluence, causes environmental issues as well. Poverty, just the opposite end of that, causes environmental issues, because when you're poor, you don't worry very much about what you're doing to the environment. Your concern is really survival. If you have to cut down all the wood around your village because you need to make charcoal to cook or wood to cook food, and it's a matter of survival, you're not so concerned about the ecosystem of the forest. Now maybe you should, because you're going to run out of wood, and it means you have to travel further to get it, and further, and at some point it just won't be worthwhile, it won't be possible. But poverty itself causes a number of environmental issues as well. And the last thing is that the cost of environmental issues are not built in to the processes or the products we use in modern society. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, you go out and you buy an iPod. You pay what Apple, demands you pay for that iPod. But not built into that cost, in all cases, is the cost of dealing with that iPod, let's say, when it's broken and has to be thrown away. So it goes into a landfill or whatever else. And in other words, it still costs us something to deal with the environmental issue related to that product, but the cost of dealing with it isn't built into the product. When you buy a car, you'll pay a lot for the car, but you're not paying the cost of dealing with all the pollution that's going to come out of that car for 10, 15, 20 years you might have that car. Those costs are not internalized into the product. They're external costs. And so it turns out all of society has to deal with them. And so you don't pay the cost, when you buy a car of, paving the roads and the loss of ecosystems that incurs. And so this idea that if we actually paid the true price of products to deal with the environmental problems they may cause, of course our products would be a lot more expensive, and maybe that would help cut down on consumption, which was one of the prior reasons for causing pollution. But that's something that environmental economists have looked at for many, many years, is how do we internalize the price of environmental issues and problems into the price of the products and services that we buy and use. The book then goes into what a sustainable society is, and that's how it ends. And that basically talks about wouldn't it be nice if we could do all these things? And many of those things we're starting to do in many places. California, of course, is a leader in many of those. That's one of the reasons I came to California after I got my degrees in environmental science, and because back then California was one of the few states that was doing so much about the environment, and they still are a leader. You know, I'm now here in Pennsylvania, and finding it a little bit in the dark ages when it comes to environmental issues, but I'll survive somehow. Okay, well that's enough for Chapter 1, so I'll leave you now. Please remember to keep up with the syllabus, and I will see you when we get to Chapter 2.